Hey, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright from Blogging Heads TV, and you are Fadi Quran. I met you last month when I traveled to Israel and the West Bank. You are a Palestinian activist, and I want to ask you about Palestinian activism and recent events, including the UN resolution for Palestinian statehood. But first, I wanted to hear a little bit about you. You're very young, as I recall, and also you actually studied over here at Stanford, right? You got your undergraduate degree here.
Yeah, I studied physics and international relations at Stanford, and now I'm pursuing a master's in Palestinian law and human rights. And I started an alternative energy startup in the West Bank that deals mostly with wind energy.
Mostly with wind energy, because when I was over there, the thing I most noted was the abundance of solar energy bearing down upon my head.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of sun here. We have about 305 days a year of sun, so we're also trying to bring in some solar panels and to use solar technology, and hopefully that's going to be very successful here once the conflict and the political situation gets a little calmer.
Yeah, that's yet another reason to stop the conflict, I guess, is so that we can get this solar energy source, tap it optimally. That's I'll add that to a long list of reasons to want peace in the Middle East. Tell me a little about how the UN resolution is playing out over there among Palestinians. I mean, as most of our viewers probably know, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, last week asked the UN to grant statehood membership to Palestine as a state and therefore recognize its statehood. The U.S. and Israel are opposed. The U.S. is trying to see to it that Abbas will not get the 9 out of 15 votes needed in the Security Council. And if he does get them, then the U.S. will just veto. Presumably the Palestinians will take it to the General Assembly where they could get a kind of a milder affirmation of statehood. It would be like a non-member observer state type status. So anyway, I would assume that this initiative has a fair amount of support over there?
Yeah, it has a very good amount of support, but people are generally both pessimistic and what's the word I'm looking for? Skeptical about what's going to happen next. Initially, when Mahmoud Abbas gave his speech, there was a lot of excitement, but that's quickly dying down. And what most people expect to happen is that this issue is just going to be postponed for a very long time, and everyone understands that nothing is going to change on the ground. So people, initially you had a honeymoon period, 2 days, 3 days after Mahmoud Abbas gave his speech, but right now, people are kind of waking up to the reality, and a lot are asking what's next.
So you mean they think that nothing's going to change even if Palestine gets some recognition of statehood, even if only in the General Assembly? Or they're just pessimistic that it's even going to get that far?
I think both. About the General Assembly, people expect that if we go to the General Assembly, and it's still not certain that we will go, but if we go, we expect to get the amount of votes needed but we won't have full membership in the UN. We'll become, a non-member observing state. And so we won't have any voting rights. Now that will have slight benefits in the short run, like the ability to, take Israeli criminals of war to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, or so forth. But on the ground, people understand that the balance of power is so skewed towards Israel that people's day-to-day lives, like the fact that my home only gets water once a week, people understand that won't change.
And I mean, why is that you only get water once a week? I mean, are there settlements around where you live, by the way? Israeli settlements?
Yeah, there are 2 big settlements. One is called the Psagot, and the other one's called Beit El. And Beit El is actually the command center for the rest of the West Bank. It's where the Israeli Civil Administration, which is the body that controls basically a good amount of the day-to-day lives of Palestinians is located, is headquartered. And the settlers get, at least the last statistics I read by Amnesty International said that settlers in the West Bank get about 6 times as much water as the Palestinians. And per capita, the ratio is even worse. So, because my house is so close to one of the settlements, they take all the water and we don't get any water. But we can watch them swim in their swimming pools from the top of my house.
So it's not just that they built a nice water system for the settlements, but not for you. It's that the settlements actually deplete your supply of water.
Yeah, they deplete, and to a very exaggerated level. Like they use, like I said, last estimates I read is that they use twice as much the recommended amount of water by the World Health Organization for settlements compared to Palestinians who use, I think, 1/3 or get 1/3 of the amount recommended by the World Health Organization. And the problem we have is that they're supposed to be, based on the Oslo agreements, the interim agreements, there's supposed to be a commission that consists of Palestinians and Israelis who vote on issues pertaining to water, like how to distribute water, and if there are any problems, this commission is supposed to solve these problems. But the basic problem with this committee is that the Israeli side has veto power, whereas the Palestinian side doesn't. So although you can say, oh, there's a committee of Palestinians and Israelis who decide how the water resources are distributed, de facto, Israel completely controls that committee.
Kind of reminds me of the Security Council in a certain sense. So what do you do for water during all the times when you don't have water? Do you, when you don't have running water, but you need water, right? What do you do?
So for the most part, what the vast majority of people in the West Bank do right now is they try to store enough water to last them until the next time that they get, until the next time that the Israeli government opens the water tap again. And you have to ration water a lot. But on the other hand, in some places they don't get water for months, especially in like the southern Hebron Hills. And there they have to bring in water from other places or buy it back from Israeli sources. And when you buy water and you get it tanked to your house, that costs about 10 times as much as it would cost to get it normally using the tap. So you have places that, locations where people are literally spending 30 to 40% of their monthly income just on getting water, which is preposterous.
It does seem suboptimal. So what are the in terms of everyday frustrations you encounter or grievances you have that motivate you to be an activist, where does this rank? Are there others that are kind of at the top of your list?
There are many complaints that are caused by the Israeli matrix of control that exists over us in the West Bank, and honestly, I could name at least 12 or 15 right now. But I think at least for the type of audience that's going to be watching our discussion, it's better to summarize these complaints in 3 main values, which is that here we Palestinians lack freedom, justice, and dignity. And by freedom, I mean specifically in the sense that people should be writing the laws and rules and regulations that govern their day-to-day lives. That was the centerpiece of both the American and the French revolutions, the idea of democracy. And here in Palestine, we lack that. Most of our lives and most of the laws that significantly control or restrict our lives are put there by either the Israeli, by the Israeli occupation, basically, or the Israeli civil administration. When I say we lack justice, we lack social justice, in the sense that the settlers abuse our resources and get much more resources than we as Palestinians do. And we also lack justice in the sense that, supposedly everyone deserves to have at least the basic amount of equal rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, and so forth. And all these freedoms and human rights that we believe that all humans should have equally, here in Palestine, there's discrimination or a sense of segregation, where if you're Israeli, you just get more rights and you can control and again restrict the lives of the average Palestinians. And then the third thing is dignity, which is just we're not treated with respect by the Israeli, oppression, by the Israeli regime. People really feel like every time for example, every time I walk home and I see a settlement, and then I see how my own people are living in my neighborhood, you just feel like you are being disrespected. Like every clause of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is just not being fulfilled for you simply because of the fact that you're Palestinian and maybe carrying a green ID. And so I can again name all my complaints, but they'll come under one of those main objectives of the Palestinian struggles.
Okay, so what Israelis say, or some Israelis say, when when you tell them about this, and some of them are quite aware of it, is that we would love to have a two-state solution, but we've learned from painful experience that it's an intolerable threat to our security to to give the Palestinians full control of a state so close to our borders. That's what some of them say. I mean, there's a variety of things they say, but it's one thing. And I will say there is genuine fear among a lot of Israelis. I think the Second Intifada is partly responsible for that. A lot of them knew people who were killed in suicide bombings or something. So, I find even some Israelis who seem well-meaning have that kind of fear of that kind of fear of the kind of peace deal that a lot of people talk about.
Yeah, but I think, although I can understand the fear they have, I think they don't understand what are the consequences of both, the deeper consequences that have caused them to both have this fear and have made the situation so bad. If you wanted to think of what could be a perfect solution to this conflict, something maybe too idealist right now, but hopefully will happen, is that if you get Palestinians and Israelis, Jewish Israelis, to sit down and write a social contract generally based on the ideals I just mentioned, which are the objectives of the Palestinian struggle: freedom, justice, and dignity. Now, if we go back and try to analyze the fear that the Israeli, that, for example, Netanyahu spoke a lot about why you can't give the Palestinians a state, because we fear that we'll be attacked. But I think history has shown that oppression is truly what causes, in many cases, violence. And in this situation, I don't think the solution to avoid more violence is to increase the restrictions and to increase the oppression that Israel forces upon Palestinians. And at the same time, I also think that this fear doesn't only come from the experiences of the Second Intifada or so forth. I think that generally there's always a fear that based on the historical experiences of the Jewish people, that because we've experienced so much atrocities and we've experienced so much oppression, we need to have complete control over our surroundings, and that causes them to increase, I think, whenever there is this sense of fear, to increase the oppression that's imposed on the Palestinian people. And that leads to a vicious cycle of violence. I think what the average Israeli needs to understand is that the only thing they have to fear is fear itself, because it's fear that's making the situation worse. And it's the fear and the consequences, or what they implement based on their fears, that actually makes them more insecure.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that fear is a problem. I think they would answer, when you claim that all they have to fear is fear itself, that their fears do have some demonstrable basis in reality. And this gets back to the vicious circle you were talking about. It's true that that fear breeds reaction, which increases fear, and so on. It's also true, of course, that it works in the other direction. There's a virtuous cycle, which is that if the fear starts to subside, they treat you better, the violence subsides, and then trust can grow, and so on. Things can move in the other direction. Of course, the problem, it seems to me, is that there are people on both sides in whose interest it is, or at least as they see it, for things not to work out so easily and so well. And on the Palestinian side, this means that, there are people who want to use violence. You are yourself committed to nonviolent resistance, but, it just seems so easy for one faction in, say, Gaza, even if it's not Hamas, and there are, of course, more radical factions than Hamas in Gaza, to kind of spoil things, right? Isn't that a big problem you're going to face going forward and trying to sustain a nonviolent movement?
I mean, there are going to be significant problems that we're going to face as we move forward, and that's one of them. But I think first we need to remember that we shouldn't equate the Palestinian and Israeli sides in terms of this use of violence, or in terms of fear generally, because at the moment you have Israel's the dominant power. Israel's the power controlling relatively the day-to-day lives of the Palestinians. And here, if we want to measure or quantify violence, Israel's the main purveyor of violence in the region, and that violence is focused against Palestinians. But that does cause a vicious cycle, and like you said, even strategically, right now, the use of armed struggle or violence will make the situation worse, not better. Now, I think if we want to look at historical experiences with the use of popular resistance or nonviolent resistance, what we'll see, going back to Gandhi in India and even the civil rights movement in the U.S., is that there have always been people who have attempted to, derail any the escalation of the nonviolent struggle. And the only thing that made, that helped Martin Luther King succeed or expand the movement, and the same thing with India, was that people began to see successes based on the nonviolent movement. The civil rights movement achieved very visible successes, and equally Gandhi achieved visible successes in India. And I think once the movement here in Palestine begins to achieve successes, and it has historically achieved successes that maybe the Palestinian leadership didn't know how to invest in well, but in the long run, the more visible successes we achieve, the more people will come around this situation, and the more the people who decide to use violence in an unethical manner, let's say, will be sidelined.
Okay.
But Bob, I want to say something quickly, which is, I think I'm going to have to open the light because it's getting dark here.
Okay. So feel free.
Yeah, give me a second. Sorry about that.
That's okay. What is it? It's 6:30 over there. 6:30 p.m.
Yeah, it's 6:30 right now.
Okay. Yeah, you're. So you seem prepared to soldier on and try not to let violence stop you. Do you worry in that regard about people trying to provoke you into getting violent? I mean, there are demonstrations. There are regular weekly demonstrations in some villages in Palestine. And are you worried? I mean, I assume that some of the settlers would like to provoke you to violence. I've heard cynical people say that the current Israeli government wouldn't mind having its soldiers provoke you into violence. But is that a problem you've already encountered or expect to encounter, or what?
Yeah, it's a problem we've encountered a bunch of times. Both, Israeli settlers, first of all, tried to provoke. Only 2 days ago, an Israeli settler ran over a 11-year-old kid, and about a week ago, I think 6 days ago, a person was killed by a settler in a village called Kusra, which Mahmoud Abbas actually mentioned in his speech, or he mentioned that a guy was killed. And of course, and settlers come down to villages or to cities, and they try to burn houses, they burn cars, and so forth. And even to some extent, Israeli soldiers, once they come into villages, for example, they will try to provoke people verbally or by doing specific acts like pushing women to the ground, or let's say attacking someone's honor and so forth. Will try to provoke people into violence. And
now this is in the context of demonstrations, you mean?
Both within demonstrations and generally. I mean, I recall a story where a man was forced to kiss a woman that he didn't know on a checkpoint near one of the Palestinian universities, Birzeit universities. And these acts, the goal of such acts is to provoke Palestinians into going into the direction of violent confrontation, because, like I said, the playing field of violence in the West Bank is hugely tilted in Israel's favor. Israel is one of the most powerful militaries in the world. They have a lot of weapons. They get a lot of military funding from the U.S. and so forth. So whenever they can have any confrontation with the Palestinians, they want to make it violent, because they know both that they can win in such a confrontation, and they also know that if the confrontation is violent on both sides, the average viewer in the U.S. is not going to say, oh yeah, or is not going to understand that the balance of power is so skewed towards Israel. They're going to say, oh, there are two sides fighting, and it will make it seem like a war. But it's going to need a lot of training, a lot of discipline on our part to pursue civil disobedience and to pursue direct action in a non-violent manner, to make it successful and to prevent ourselves from being provoked. And here, we can learn from past experiences, both in Palestine and even from the U.S. during the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I heard something when I was over there about and actually I should pause here and say that in general, when you say these things about Israel's use of violence, there are things I can imagine Israelis saying in response. And I'm not going to pretend to adequately defend the position of these people. I hope to have, we've had Israelis on. I hope to have more on in this context. I'm hoping to even get a leader of a settlement on. And maybe someday we'll even have an Israeli talking to a Palestinian. But I just want to emphasize I'm not, this is not like a debate. We're just getting your side of the story. So while I was over there, I heard that there's actually going to be something like the Freedom Rider movement in the South when blacks would refuse to sit in the back of the bus. There's something related to buses that are for settlers only or something?
Yeah, there are young Palestinians, college students and even some high school students who plan to do something similar to the freedom rides in the U.S., which is that here in the West Bank there are settler-only roads, and then the settlements have their own infrastructure that's imposed on Palestinians, and they have their own transportation system and so forth. And if you're a Palestinian like me and you're given the green identity card, you're not allowed to use those buses, and you're not allowed to go into Jerusalem. There are a lot of places that are completely closed off to Palestinians. Now, to challenge this form of segregation and discrimination, what these young Palestinians plan to do, young Palestinian activists plan to do, is that they're going to go to an attempt to get on, some of these buses completely non-violently, doing the exact same thing that happened 50 years ago in the U.S., where young African Americans and white Americans decided to end segregation in the South by getting on segregated buses. And hopefully it's going to succeed here as well. I think such a move is going to have a lot of resonance and is going to challenge the Israeli system of segregation in a very direct manner.
Mm-hmm. And when you say you're not allowed to go to Jerusalem, you mean even East Jerusalem, which under international law is not part of Israeli territory, right?
Yeah, I'm not allowed into any part of Jerusalem simply because I'm given a green ID, which indicates that I was born Palestinian in a specific area.
Okay. Where do you envision this going? I mean, you want to do civil disobedience, you want to have demonstrations, you have specific grievances about political rights and human rights and surely material things, like access to water, which I guess some people would consider a human right maybe, but where do you, in the context of a long-term solution, two-state solution, one-state solution, do you have a clear idea where this is heading or where you want it to head?
I do to some extent, but I think a real solution, a real defined solution is going to have to go beyond the specific structures that are being given to the one-state solution or the two-state solution. If we want to look at where could the perfect solution to this conflict come from, I think we need to look at human progress generally, and we need to look at the basic needs of humans. Anyone living in this region, the Holy Land, let's say, who is human. And I think, based on my belief, what people really need to survive and to be happy generally in their life, they need freedom, justice, and dignity. And they need to be allowed to pursue happiness. Now, if in a perfect world you could get Palestinian intellectuals and thinkers, and you could also get Israeli thinkers or intellectuals, and say, okay, let's sit down and establish a social contract in which people will, in which everyone in this region can be made to live the best life possible. And within that, okay, so we're going to take this context and say, okay, people are going to sit behind this, let's say, veil of ignorance, learn from history, but not allow their decisions to be defined by historical or political context, and they establish a social contract for both Palestinians and Israelis. What would such a contract look like? And
So by veil of ignorance, this is this idea that suppose you didn't know whether you were Palestinian and Israeli, right, or Israeli.
Yeah.
You had to design the social contract in the abstract. You just have, right, that's the idea.
Yeah, you knew that once you were, let's say, introduced back into the world, you knew that there was, let's say, a 50-50% chance that you can either be Palestinian or Israeli. Mm-hmm. What type of social contract would you establish for that type of society? Now, I think based on my personal research and my personal, just studying of the conflict, I think that the two-state solution, as it is proposed today, doesn't establish for the Palestinian people, specifically those four objectives: freedom, justice, dignity, and the ability or capability to pursue opportunity and happiness.
And how is it most glaringly lacking in that respect? What's a good example of something that a two-state solution would neglect?
For example, one of the main things that such a solution would neglect is resources for the Palestinian people, especially, let's say, for the rights of Palestinian refugees. And the question is, can you bring what would happen if you bring 6 million Palestinians back into the West Bank and Gaza? Would it be sustainable for that population, or will they have to continue to be refugees? Another problem, I think, is that with the sense of fear that exists in Israeli society, something that we were mentioning before due to the historical context and experiences of Israeli Jews, I don't think the two-state solution will solve that conflict. I don't think the fear that exists will be ended, and the sense of insecurity that exists will be ended by a two-state framework. Netanyahu said that. Netanyahu said we're going to have to control specific parts of the West Bank, specifically the Jordan Valley and some of the hills in the West Bank. What that de facto means is that they're going to continue to impose a lot of control on the Palestinian population. And then there are a lot of issues regarding economic development that could happen in the West Bank, and how likely will the West Bank be, or how likely is the West Bank and Gaza, the future Palestinian state based on two-state solution, to succeed? And then you have another question, so I can keep going with the difficulties that a two-state solution poses to this framework.
Okay, let me zero in on the one thing you mentioned, though, which is the return of the refugees. These are people outside of Israel, Palestine, who presumably, I don't know actually how many of the 6 million would actually want to come back. I've wondered that, and maybe you know better than I do. But and it would depend, of course, on what they could come back to. But what you said, kind of terrifies a lot of Israelis, right? Because what you're saying is, look, the West Bank and Gaza can't accommodate the refugees, so some of them are going to have to go into what is now Israel proper. This is in the context of what would actually, of course, be a unified one state involving, comprising both Israel and Palestine. And, the Israelis, well, some of them imagine ethnic cleansing. Some of them imagine that once the Arabs are a majority in a single state, they will actually kick the Israelis, kind of the Jews, out of the country, and more in a more modest fear maybe is that at a minimum some would the descendants of people who were kicked off of their specific property in 1948, and in a place like Jaffa, that's a huge amount of property, right? Or in that area, but people who were, so the descendants come back and they say, my parents lived in this house, you've got to get out. And of course, the people living in the houses now aren't the ones who kicked out their parents, and for the most part, and so they're like, it is natural, it seems to me, that to the extent that this scenario is plausible, Israelis would not welcome it, right?
I mean, we need to remember within the basic framework of at least the type of social contract that I'm talking about, is that Israelis would be given the basic rights just as much as Palestinians, freedom, justice, dignity, and the capability to pursue happiness. Now, again, the question is, based on the questions you asked, the question shouldn't be, okay, these are terrifying questions or terrifying things to think about. The question should be, how do we maximize justice? How do we maximize freedom and dignity and opportunity for everyone in the region? Now, if we were looking at this problem, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, through that lens, instead of through the lens of fear, I'm sure many of the questions you just asked, I'm sure that many of the questions you just mentioned, or you just asked, could be solved by a lot of creative people who, unfortunately, due to the framework that you just presented, due to the mindsets that persist in how this conflict is thought of, it's something that won't happen.
So you're saying such concerns do have to be addressed, but first you have to sit down and start talking seriously about them, and that's not happening. I mean, concerns that the Israelis have, you think do need to be part of the discussion and taken seriously, but you can't do that until you start talking about a solution of this sort.
But a solution not based on the nationalistic or historical perspectives or political perspectives of both sides, but based on these larger values.
Yeah. Of course, the other thing that people might think listening to this is okay, here's this nice young, well-educated man who's read his John Rawls, but he's not typical of Palestinians. We know that they're singing a different tune, and some people in Islamic Jihad, some people in Hamas, and so on. But I'm sure you're aware of this. I just note the kind of skepticism you're going to encounter.
I mean, there's always going to be skeptics, but I think it's always also important to remember that basically what all humans are looking for, outside even of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is a sense of happiness, is a sense of comfort, is a sense of compassion towards others, is freedom in its very deep sense. I think once people can understand that there are ways to pursue some of the goals that I was just, we were just speaking about, and there are ways to achieve them, and they see others working hard and sacrificing to achieve those goals, the vast majority of both Palestinians and Israelis will begin to pursue this path. Because even if you want to look at it from a sensical perspective, it's not a zero-sum game. This conflict is not a zero-sum game, and it's not even a game of trying to push, to push both sides into each other and see who's going to win at the game. It could be something much deeper. And here I want to focus that a significant amount of Palestinians, especially of this new generation of Palestinians that, becoming, that are entering into college between the ages of, say, 18 and 30, agree with the perspective that I'm presenting. And it's also important to note that wherever there existed struggles to achieve progress for humanity, whether it was the movement to end slavery that began in the UK, whether it was the civil rights movement, or whether it was the movement to end British imperialism and colonialism in India, there were always skeptics. And it always began with the skeptics being much more than the people who are working on the ground. But here I'll quote President Obama, one thing he mentioned in one of his speeches, where he says, if there's one person who's brave enough to stand up in a room and demand what is right, then maybe a few more people will stand up in that room. And if a few people stand up in a room, maybe they will cause a few people to stand up in their town. And if a town stands up, then maybe a city will stand up. And if a city stands up, maybe we can change the nation. And this is the perspective we're working with, where, although we may have idealist goals, on the ground the way we work, strategize, think, and plan is very strategic. And that's why I think a lot of hope and a bright future exists for the Palestinian people and for all the people living in the Middle East, regardless of what religion, ethnicity, or nationality they belong to.
Okay. Well, tell me a little bit about this. I got the sense when I was over there that there are a number of these young Palestinians like you who are approaching this from a different angle. It's a nonviolent resistance. They're focusing on drawing attention to issues of human rights, political rights, and so on. Tell me how this kind of got off the ground. It seems like one of the first conspicuous reflections of your efforts was the March 15th movement, in which I think you were quite active, right?
Yeah, I was active in the March 15th movement.
Well, explain what that was. That's March 15th of this year.
So the goal of the March 15th movement was to end the disunity between Fatah and Hamas, which are the two main Palestinian political parties. But it wasn't a demand for them to just sit down together and reach an agreement. It had a long-term demand of Palestinian National Council elections. Now, the Palestinian National Council can be seen as the parliament that should be representing all Palestinians around the world. And the last time the people, the members of this body, this parliament, let's say, was changed was in 1988, the year I was born. And it's never had democratic elections. No one in this parliamentary body has never had democratic elections. And many of the rules that exist for how this parliament should be created, and it's part of the PLO and so forth, none of the rules or regulations have been followed. The demand was to democratize this body so that all Palestinians could elect people to represent them, regardless of where these Palestinians live. And then this parliament could set, a solution to the division, the disunity between Fatah and Hamas, and could also set a long-term agenda and strategy for the Palestinian struggle, something that currently doesn't exist right now.
Okay. Now, this was actually, I gather, opposed by both Fatah and Hamas, right? Either explicitly or in fact?
Yeah, both sides. We came down to the streets on March 15th. There were thousands of people protesting, and both Fatah and Hamas tried to shut the protests down and arrested a few of the youth activists, or stole their cameras and did stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think they feared? What were they afraid of?
I think both parties understand that they are, in a very large to a very large extent, becoming historical relics. That there's a new generation that really does not believe in the leadership of both parties and really does not believe in the politics and mentalities that they espouse. And so what they were both afraid of is that this was a revolution against them, that this was the continuation of the Arab Spring and a movement to topple their governments. And of course they don't want to allow any new challenge, any new competition to bud out from the grassroots level, so they try to shut it down as quickly as possible or co-opt it.
Mm-hmm. And are there signs that in Gaza, as in the West Bank where you are, there's a significant young nonviolent movement?
And I think everywhere in the West Bank there's a youth movement that's beginning. I want to make the distinction that they're young movements of people who want to achieve change and who believe in popular resistance in the sense of mobilizing the people. And in Gaza, not only in Gaza are there such youth groups, but you can also find them in Lebanon, and you can find them in Jordan and Egypt and all around the world, even within Israel. You can find in places like Jaffa, Nazareth, and the north, where there's a significant Palestinian population. There are youth groups that are just organically popping out. They just everyone's reaching the same consensus, but in a very organic manner.
So it's part of the Arab Spring in a way.
It is.
And the reason I ask about Gaza in particular is because when some people hear you say that you sought a reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, they're going to get very scared, of course, because Hamas is associated with violence and has, in fact, committed a fair amount of violence over the years, although not a lot lately. Is there a reason they shouldn't be scared at the thought of Hamas becoming a more prominent player in a unified Palestinian movement?
I think the way your question is phrased is a bit unclear or mixes up a lot of situations generally, which is, I think the most important thing to begin with in order to answer your question is to remember, although like I said, personally I believe in using nonviolent tactics and strategies to achieve goals, in a broad sense it should be remembered that the Palestinians as an occupied and colonized people have a right to use violence, to use military tactics, to use armed insurrection to achieve their goals of liberation, as long as they use those tactics within a moral and ethical framework. The second thing I think that needs clarification is that Hamas is not simply this one big bulk, let's say, one big body. It can be subdivided into many different subgroups. So for example, if I want to give a metaphor, you can look at the Republican Party. Not everyone in the Republican Party is part of the Tea Party, although many members of the Tea Party will vote Republican. And it's a similar situation within Hamas. Now, the vast majority of people that were politically elected to the Palestinian Legislative Council that were Hamas members were actually doctors, college professors, and so forth. People who had served their society, people who lived within the community, and not what not what you would call militants, or not people who, let's say, fire rockets and so forth. They were political figures, and a lot of Palestinians agree with a lot of Hamas's political, you can say political philosophy. And so just through a democratic process, although, for example, you can have an American who would say, I hated when George Bush was president because I'm against war, and George Bush started the Iraq war and committed atrocities and so forth. The fact that you disagree with George Bush's policies shouldn't make it so that it's not allowed for any other Republican to run for government. And I think people should understand that it's the same thing with Hamas. Hamas is not just one big boogeyman. Hamas consists of different levels and branches and people with different mentalities and ideologies.
Okay, but on that first point, you're saying that as a, I don't know if you're talking about as a matter of kind of ethical philosophy or even in some sense a body of thought in international law, you're saying people who are being occupied and oppressed actually do have a right to respond violently, right?
Yeah, that's part of international law. I mean, the American Revolution was, a violent revolution against, the British colonizers. And in international law, I was speaking from a purely legal perspective. International law gives, occupied people or colonized people the right to begin liberation movements and to use militant insurgency to achieve liberation. That's actually a right in international law. So regardless of my perspective or anyone's ethical perspective on the use of violence, in international law, liberation movements are given the right, and it's legitimate for them to use violence.
So you don't yourself favor the tactic, but you're saying it's not as far beyond the pale. I guess you might say when you look at various people whose armed struggles America has supported, say in Latin America or wherever, you're arguing that this is not beyond the pale, even though you yourself do not favor it as a tactic.
Yeah, personally, I don't favor it. And I think maybe a lot of specific methods, again, in international law, it gives you the right to use violence, the right to be, an insurgent. But it also sets limits on what you can use. There are some things that you can't do. Even though you may be trying to liberate your country from a colonizer, it's still wrong to kill innocent people. And, you're not given the right to kill innocent people under international law.
So Hamas has violated, the bounds of what you would consider the legitimate use of violence by an occupied, oppressed people. They've gone beyond those bounds.
I think based on international law, you could argue that. But again, I think the important discussion here, and this always happens when we're discussing the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is that in Palestine, in this conflict, Israel is the main purveyor of violence. Israel has killed literally 1,000 times in the history of this conflict, 1,000 times more innocent people than what Hamas or any Palestinian faction has ever killed. At the same time, Israel is enslaving, you can call it the enslavement of a people due to its policies and its matrix of control. So the discussion, I think the most important discussion we should be having right now is how do we end the Israeli oppression and how do we end Israeli violence? Because we can talk of Palestinian incidents of the use of violence, and we can talk about their ethical and moral aspects of the Palestinian use of this issue. But what we need to be discussing right now is how do we put an end to the situation that Israel has enforced on the ground, and this is the situation that is causing violence. And it's, again, we shouldn't be attempting to blame the victim in any sense.
Yeah, of course, again, Israel would have arguments about who and who isn't innocent among the people they killed and so on, but I'm not capable of taking their side of this argument. But let's move on to the question then, the important question in light of what you said, of whether your view that nonviolence is the better path is really the ascendant view. I mean, do you sense a growth in momentum? I went to a demonstration when I was there in the West Bank, and it wasn't a huge turnout. It was at the, what is it called, the Kalandia checkpoint, or what's it called? Kalandia? Or,
it's the Kalandia checkpoint near the apartheid wall.
It was significant, but it wasn't thousands and thousands of people, it seemed like. So tell me what you're sensing. Do you get the tangible sense that you're gaining momentum in any sense?
I think a lot of momentum is being gained on the ground right now in terms of for example, although the protests at Kalandia USA didn't have a significant amount of people relatively, it still had a good amount of people, let's say relative to past experiences or relative to the last 10 years. And even the fact that people are coming down to the streets to use this tactic not just at Colombia, of course, but in villages all around the West Bank. And the fact that even Mahmoud Abbas in his speech mentioned this fact that a lot of people were using nonviolent tactics in different villages in the West Bank. And on May 15th, we saw Palestinian refugees trying to march back home from Lebanon and Syria. So the movement is gaining momentum. Now, I think it's important to note that here in the West Bank, what this is called is, a popular struggle. Which means a mass struggle. It's not called nonviolent resistance just because the term in Arabic isn't as clear and doesn't, it doesn't mean the same thing.
You mean nonviolence or resistance?
No, nonviolence.
What's the translation issue there?
It's not. So nonviolence, when you talk about nonviolence in the U.S. or in any other country, people perceive Gandhi or Martin Luther King, or even what the youth movements did in Egypt and other places. Here, that example of Martin Luther King or Gandhi or the ANC in South Africa and so forth, that tactic is called muqawama sha'biyya, which translates directly to popular resistance. Now, nonviolence, when you translate it to Arabic, it doesn't sound like it's a tactic you use for struggle. It sounds more like a complete pacifist. It doesn't mean someone who struggles for their rights. It means that someone who accepts, accepts oppression, let's say, or that's how people understand it on the street. So it's just a matter of using the literal translation of the word. But you can call it, in English, you would call it, the best way to describe it would be nonviolent.
Okay. So you're using the same word, the same Arabic word that is used to describe Gandhi and Martin Luther King and so on.
Yeah, the same way people, the same way people here see it. But also, a very important discussion that's actually going on the ground here in Palestine is the situation here is different. So we need to find a term that's more specific and that's more culturally, let's say, sensitive and culturally understandable to the Palestinian people. Because, like Gandhi, for example, wasn't going around telling Indians use nonviolence. He called it satyagraha, which translates to, seeking truth, for example, in India. And so these different words, we need to find something specific to Palestine that gives our culture and tradition of nonviolent tactics a clear meaning.
Okay. Final question. We're running out of time, but the evening I met you, it was mainly Palestinian activists. There was at least one Israeli Jew there, and I gather one thing that's happening is that there is a little collaborative interaction between Palestinians and sympathetic Israeli Jews. I don't know how common that is. I certainly saw it in East Jerusalem. With the Solidarity movement. Has that started to happen much with the West Bank Palestinians?
Yes, like there's a growing movement within the Palestinian population. I think within Israel there's a small movement, but it's growing, and I think it's growing rapidly, that agrees with the fact that the Palestinian people are oppressed and agrees with the need to end the occupation and oppression of the Palestinian people, and they agree with the right of return for Palestinian refugees and so forth. There are people who, like I was saying earlier, understand that the basic goal should be freedom, justice, and dignity for everyone living in the region, not nationalistic conflict or nationalistic pursuits. And the people who, the Israelis, and a lot of them even prefer to call themselves Jewish Palestinians, there are a lot of people who are joining this movement and who plan to assist in it, but they're still a relatively small number, a very small minority.
And has that been an eye-opener for some Palestinians who previously had seen only settlers and soldiers? I mean, has it been almost a surprise to some of them to find that there are sympathetic Jews?
Yeah, sometimes it is a surprise, especially for people from my generation and younger, who grew up completely disconnected from from Israelis or Jews, due to military occupation. Most of the people my age, the only experience they would have with an Israeli or a Jew would be either having that Israeli shooting at them or having a settler beat them up.
Right, because before the Intifadas, I think it's the case that there was much more of Palestinians in the West Bank at least traveling to Israel to work, right? And there's less of that since then, right?
Yeah, there was much more interaction, and I think that's another thing to look at, which is that throughout the history of this conflict, the places where there was a larger amount of interaction between Palestinian and Jews were actually the places where there was the least amount of violence from both sides, interestingly enough, at least historically. And that's another argument for why, achieving this social contract would help solve this solution quicker.
Well, I hope it does, and I wish you well. And I want to thank you for taking the time, Fadi. I hope you'll come back and see us again.
Hopefully. Thank you for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Okay. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.